Hello again, and welcome to another session on the Mahayana part of the Lam Rim Chenmo, Volume 2. And today we're going to talk about the seven cause and effect, or the six cause and one effect of bodhicitta, developing the mind that sets us onto the path to the full enlightenment. Last week we touched on the common features of the methods used for this. So one of them is to develop a recognition of the importance of great compassion, universal compassion towards all beings, and the other one is to do with the developing impartiality. So a sense of impartiality towards all sentient beings. And one of the ways in which this is taught at the moment, almost at every single teaching given by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, is through thinking about how all beings share a common aim, which is to avoid suffering and to achieve joy. And therefore, he says this commonality is something that we can recognize. And then there are other methods of where we try to develop this through thinking about how in the end, if we can find a way of feeling impartial towards our friends and our enemies and those who are neutral to us, we can extend that across the whole universe. So today, from that, we're looking primarily at the remainder of the cause and effects involved. And this starts off with, and remember, this tradition of the cause and effect comes from Serlingpa, who was the teacher of Atisha, who taught who wrote the book that this text is loosely was or strongly related to. And Serlingpa lived in Sumatra or Java, and Atisha had to travel quite a long way to see him. The reason why he did that was because at the time in India, he felt that there were no clear teachings on bodhicitta, on this mind of enlightenment, and he'd heard great things of Serlingpa, who held this lineage of guaranteeing the development of the correct mind of enlightenment, which is found in sutra, but often is just praised rather than gives very, very precise instructions on how to develop it. So, so the main point today is going to be how we develop or continue to develop how we continue to develop a relationship, a familial relationship with all beings, and likewise how to work on developing this loving kindness, or this sort of a recognition of the benefits that they've given us, so that we can repay their kindness, and then on the basis of that develop this love, this strong love and a compassion, and from that we then take a step up to meet their needs, and we recognize Buddhahood to be the best way of doing that. So that's how we will work. So before I start on the actual text, let's just set motivation, which is exactly what this text is about. So doing our best to recognize a sense of love and kindness towards all sentient beings, to recognize that they share the sufferings that we suffer, the suffering of samsara, and also normal contaminated sufferings, and that because the only way in which we can really benefit is through becoming a Buddha. We say, okay, I want to do my best to use the text to inspire me to tread the bodhisattva path, the path to enlightenment, to become a fully enlightened being, on the basis that I may actually make a difference to infinite number of sentient beings, an endless number of sentient beings, and therefore continually work to reduce their suffering and to bring joy. So I think that's really what we're looking at in terms of today, in terms of setting our motive. So Je Rinpoche, so I said before, we sort of covered the attitude to do with developing impartiality. And if we recall, the basic meditation, the methodology for this was this idea primarily of looking at three groups: those who we are friendly towards, who we consider our friends; those who we are impartial about and sort of not particularly interested in, neutral feelings towards; and those who we would rather not be in the same room with, are sort of enemies. So of these, then again, what we're saying is there's a sort of generally, in a normal sense, the friends are those who we wouldn't want to, we're slightly attached to. Yeah, so we sort of like, we can get a little bit jealous maybe if they don't give us enough attention, or they meet somebody else. And this sort of thing is obviously we're wanting to reduce our attachment towards them. Those who we're sort of not bothered about, we sort of don't really have an opportunity to develop any sort of relationship with them. And those who are slightly, who we see as our enemies, we really actually would often prefer them to be harmed than anything else. And these are the attitudes that we are trying to work on, so that we can't imagine that as a Buddha, a Buddha's going to say, well, I'm only enlightening you lot because you're my friends, and you can go away, not interested in you. So in order to have a bodhisattva mind, this mind that is similar to and related to a Buddha mind, in terms of the enlightening path, we've got to develop this impartiality. So the methodology used is to start with those we're close to, then move to those people who we know, who we're sort of not really bothered by, and then extend that to those who we rather not spend time with. And then once we've established that relationship, we extend that further and further, recognizing that all beings would fall into one of those categories, such that if we can find a reason to be impartial towards our enemies and our friends and those who we're indifferent about, then we can be impartial to all beings. So this basis is absolutely necessary for us to establish the following, the actual meditation, because without this impartiality, then we have a biased mind. So normally we don't want to establish enemies, but for the purpose of the meditation, it's good to be honest, brutally honest in ourselves about this. So a lot of what this text is about, in fact, specifically the Lam Rim Chenmo, is this isn't about learning about all the different arguments for or against, or what such and such have to say about this, but primarily it's a practitioner's manual, how we can dedicate our lives, how we can work to becoming Buddhas, or becoming better people at the very least. So on that, the next stage from developing impartiality is developing this sense of affection. And Kamala Shila says, Je Rinpoche, Lama Tsongkhapa uses Kamala Shila a lot in this chapter, and also in this section of the text. So he says, when our mind is moistened by love, loving kindness, our mind becomes like fertile soil, and we plant the seed of compassion, it grows easily and bountifully. Therefore, once we once we've infused our mind with love, we can also cultivate compassion. So clearly, the love that we're talking about, or Kamala Shila is talking about here, Je Rinpoche points out, is this sort of affection towards all beings as if they were our dear children. And so by cultivating this impartiality, there's no unevenness between our attitude from the bias of our normal mind. And so our attachment and hostility are diminished, and our mind becomes like a great field that is able to plant the seed of compassion, watered by affection and love. So as we said last week, by having a positive, a loving mind, a sort of a relationship of kindness and of thoughtfulness towards people, allows for us to establish love and therefore establish compassion. So it's only with this developing the sense of a relationship with it, a kinship or a connection, that we're able to really start substantially managing to make meaningful loving kindness and meaningful compassion. And he says, with this view, then this is very, very easy. When we're able to develop our this base sort of superpower, which I just described last time, of this strong um, uh, um, impartiality or equanimity, as it's sometimes called, um, then and having this sense of kinship, this sort of relationship with everybody, then this love grows naturally and the compassion grows naturally, and it's very easy for us in compared to not doing that. And if we don't do this process, it's much, much harder to establish. So the traditional methodology used within the Buddhist, within Buddhism, from Serlingpa, is to recognize that all beings are our mothers. Now, we sometimes struggle with this, especially in the modern world, because not all of us find it easy or familiar to accept rebirth at all. And if we do, then we're still a little bit like not 100% convinced, not completely bought into it. And there are ways in which we can actually deal with that. So, but the important thing is to develop this sense of strong relationship and also a recognition of the kindness that has come our way. And there are many different ways of doing that. And so one of them in terms of developing kinship is, as I said before, is recognizing how actually from a scientific viewpoint, because all life on Earth stemmed from a common ancestor. We are all family. We're all cousins. All of us are cousins. And those which are, and again, we can find in the Vinaya and other texts, we can see that those that are younger than us are like our children. Those who are about our age are like our brothers and sisters. And those who are older than us are like our parents or our aunts and our uncles as well. So being able to establish this sense of family and familiarity helps us to feel that rather than, um, a stranger, this is a brother. And they might not feel that I'm their brother, but that's on their side, not on mine. So on my side, in terms of the development of my loving kindness or whatever, to recognize them as being brothers and sisters, or cousins, or nephews and nieces, or children, or grandchildren, and parents and grandparents really helps us develop this sense of kinship. And obviously we need to be inclusive, completely inclusive is the whole point. So inclusion here again, as I said before in Lamrim, is absolutely relevant. The idea that everybody except for the Javanese just doesn't make any sense, right? So we have no boundary in terms of the objects of our kinship in this sense, considering within a scientific community that even banana trees are our cousins. It wouldn't make any sense for us to treat animals or humans any differently, regardless of their status or our relationship with them in a sort of common sense. So again, also another way of dealing with this is to look at the idea of saying that many humans and many animals have been involved in producing and manufacturing all of the things that we take for granted or that we buy in the shop, or we don't buy in the shop, but are made available to us. All the food that we eat has involved a huge chain of individuals in the past and the present who are working to deliver food that we may eat, and clothing and housing and all of these different things. And each of these themselves depended upon others. So we have this dependency, this huge, great big network of dependency that we live in, especially in the modern world, where everything we own or that we use or we will make use of has been manufactured or developed or constructed by people or animals or whatever. So even like we think about the food that we eat, many animals were sacrificed such that we don't have insects in our porridge or whatever. Now, you could argue, well, they're doing this for money. But when we think about it, especially in terms of the Dharma, money is nothing compared to life. And they're giving their life for us to do this for us. So there's a huge amount of opportunity here for us to recognize their kindness from being able to provide us with all of these things. So even within the scope of thinking about this in different ways, we can find opportunities, and this is what we're looking for, is opportunities for us to feel a sense of relationship, a sense of kinship, and a sense of a cherishing and recognition of the value of all these beings and how they've been valuable in our life. And so that really is the point. In fact, we can be creative about this, thinking about the earth. The earth itself is made of the bodies of our cousins, right? So there's no food available without all of those people having and beings having predeceased us. It's all plant matter. There's some sand in there, but it's mainly plant matter and animal matter that makes the earth, which gives that for which these plants grow for us to eat. So even these things, it's like everything we look around us is made up from the bodies of prior beings. And again, so from a Buddhist point of view and the traditional point of view is to recognize that because samsara is beginningless, there has never been a beginning. We have been continually reborn again and again and again in many, many different forms and formats. And in terms of the endless number of lives we've had, that means that essentially, even though there are an endless number of beings, we have developed a relationship of mother and child with every being in the past. So the point about this is to say sometimes mothers aren't particularly kind, but especially within mammals and ourselves, then there's always a primary caregiver. And so we might have a relationship issue with our mother, but generally in the first days, a young mother gives birth to a child, and there's an overwhelming biological imperative to look after the baby's needs. It's automatic and driven. And it's true, you have parents or mothers who have very difficult relationships with themselves and with their children. And in these senses, they're in a state of pain, of suffering. And this suffering's caused, if you like, from experiences that they've had or from some form of affliction, mental affliction. And so for us to say, oh, well, mothers aren't always like that, is to miss the point. To miss the point that actually samsara is found everywhere. But when we think about, in general, the biological state, the biological imperative is for a mother to care and cherish the child without any choice, without any sort of decision making involved. And it's this aspect of the recognition that all beings have been our mother, and as a mother, many times they have had this natural desire to look after us. Asanga says in this, in the levels of yogic teas, he says that not only can I see it, every person has been my mother, but also my father, my uncle, my aunt, my sister, my master, my teacher, my abbot, or somebody like that. So again, he says, Je Rinpoche says, not only have they been previously been our mothers, but they also will be our mothers in the future for a limitless number of times until we become Buddhas. Beings will continue to be our mothers. And we can reflect upon this in the sense that when we can convince ourselves one way or another that we have this cherished relationship with every sentient being, this is what we're looking for, then we can use whichever argument we like. But the idea is to then to recollect and remember their kindness. So without this, it's very hard. So whatever method we use, or we can use multiple methods together, the point is to essentially accept that and find a way to relate to all beings as having some way or another benefited us. So, or if they all will benefit us, okay? So it's not just in the past, it's also in the present and the future. And in this is this recognition of mutuality, but also of benefit, even for those who wish us ill. In many ways, they provide us dharma moments or opportunities for us to develop compassion or opportunities for us to develop tolerance. So even of those that we would consider to be doing wrong, we can actually use that as an opportunity to say how kind it is they're willing to go through this suffering of their afflictions or whatever, and in a sense, I benefit from this. How kind is that? And Buddha used these techniques himself with his cousin Devadatta, who was deeply jealous of the attention that his cousin was getting. and did all sorts of things that were wrong. But because of those things that were wrong, Buddha was able to write the Vinaya, the rules and regulations of monks, in order to be able to respond to these particular provocations that were set out by Devadatta and those who followed him. So there's much to be said for this, that this trying to develop this loving kindness, this recognition. So we've got this. This moves us into this second part, which is this remembering of the kindness. And he said, and Geshe Podawa says, primarily, in order to do this, it's very good for us to think about, if we find it hard to go into previous lives and so on, it's good to think about the kindnesses that we've received in this life first. So again and again, we'll see about Podawa, we'll see Atisha, we'll see Kamala Shila and Je Rinpoche expressing again, when we're working on these emotional meditations, to put it into the concrete, remember real examples in our life first, because otherwise it just remains an abstract or intellectual aspect. And what we want to do is to make it a real, substantial aspect. So, as I said, normally the object of our meditation in terms of remembering the kindness of our mothers is our mother, but not always. Sometimes it's easier for us to remember the kindness of somebody else. But the idea is the same. We're trying to develop this real, legitimate understanding of kindness and how kindness has been given to us so that we can recall it. So following one's own mother, and again, I said this can be extended, he said, if we imagine this mother in our life in front of us, and we think, not only has she been my mother in this life, but she has in many other previous lives as well. And as a mother, she's protected us from harm. She's provided us with many benefits and happiness. She carried us in our womb. She then, when we were helpless, newborns, she would hold us to the warmth of her flesh and would bounce us on the tips of her fingers to keep us happy. She'd suckle us at her breast, use her mouth to soften food. This happens less nowadays, but before you could buy little supermarket things of baby food, a mother would generally chew it herself and then feed it to the child. Remove mucus from our nose and use her hand to wipe away our excrement. So in many, many ways, especially, we have to remember, especially in the early days as an early mother, she nurtured us tirelessly in ways that we would find normally a little bit like, I don't want to do that. When she was hungry, when we were hungry or thirsty, she'd give us food and drink over herself. She'd always consider our needs before her own. When we were cold, she would find us clothes or something to help us. When we were poor, she'd help us with wealth, even things that were dear to her. So these things, they're not often these things that she would give for us or she would find for us were not easy for herself to obtain. It's not easy necessarily to give what you need to give for your children. And many mothers will go through incredible hardship in order to look after their own children. And they will do things that would normally be considered wrongdoing. They might steal in order to feed their children. They might prostitute themselves. They might do all sorts of things in order just to meet the needs of their child. And again, it's saying, when we're in a situation where if we suffered from illness or pain or the threat of death, our mother would make the choice on her side automatically that she would rather be sick than us, which she would rather die than us. She would rather be in pain than us. So these things, I've seen this. I mean, this happened much with my sister when she had meningitis. My parents gave their lives to her. They were willing to take on whatever they could in order for her not to have to suffer so much when she was a baby. And also, like my cousin, when she needed, she had a bad lung, and her father and her sister both donated half a lung in order to help her. So this sense of love, this cherishing mind, is not hard to find. Um, So then this idea is for us to develop and to consider this, and we should be doing this now if we can. So it's like we can to think about how much help and happiness was being provided by our mother or a kin, and again how much harm and suffering was prevented from, according to her, the best of her knowledge and ability. So obviously, our mothers are also in samsara; they're suffering. They have all sorts of funny ideas. Um, we often find it easy to go, oh, mum, and so on. But in the end, they're suffering. They're suffering with these their own problems, their own luggage that they brought, and they often give us that luggage. Which they don't mean to, but they don't know how best not to. But at the same time, their intention is very, very good, and their love is undeniable. So we've got to think a little bit about that. So when we do this, then it's like it's not just to be a words thing. It's certainly not an intellectual thing. We're trying to develop this emotional response to our this life's mother, yeah. So or primary caregiver. And again, we can do this again using the other methods I was suggesting. It doesn't have to be this one, but this is the one that Je Rinpoche is teaching. So, uh, but so then we're also looking at saying, then we give rise to this remembrance or recognizing that also our friends and our other relatives have also been our mothers, and also possibly in this life have shown the same lengths of love and degrees of love. So then we can extend this again, similar to the other meditation where we think about those neutral people in our lives who have previously have been our mothers. And likewise, we can, using what I was saying, the extended uh, 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 sort of modern approaches, we can say, the postman, I feel quite neutral about the postman, but the postman provides me letters. The postman walks every day making sure that I get my post, right? The electricity guy who's making sure that my lines work, the telephone guy, all of these people, or, a woman, it doesn't matter that they're doing their job and they're getting paid for it, but the service they're giving me is kindness, right? So this is a kindness. We might think about it in terms of, well, they're being paid, as I said, but they're giving their lives to this. Would you choose to be a postman? Maybe, maybe not. But this point is saying somebody has chosen to do this, and we benefit from that. So this way we can begin to think, okay, well, actually, amazingly, how we have been looked after. We are dependent upon so many people, so many environments, so many animals too. And this way we can sort of develop this idea of remembering the kindness. And I said, even enemies, we can remember the kindness of our enemies. Sometimes by doing wrong, they show us what not to do. And sometimes even our teachers, they show us what not to do, and we can learn from this. So it's not necessarily easy for us to say, "Oh, he's my friend, he's my enemy." This is samsara. Everything is mixed, but we can use this skillfully if we think about it creatively. We can use this to develop this powerful mind, and that's what the purpose is. We're not trying to establish facts about the world. We're trying to find ways of viewing the world where our mind becomes soft and loving. Yeah, and loving and able to feel a connection. So if what I'm saying is, or what Je Rinpoche is saying is, you have some sort of intellectual dispute about, well, it's not like that, it's not like this, the point's being missed. The point is primarily to develop this loving kindness. And who benefits at first? We benefit, right? So initially, the benefit is ours. And there are all sorts of benefits. We'll talk about that later. So then once we've developed this sense of kindness, this sense of recognizing and remembering the kindness, we move on to the third cause. And the third cause in this sense is um, yeah, that we want to repay that kindness. So we're sort of establishing, developing this relationship towards all beings. Um, and by recognizing that actually most sentient beings have no refuge, they have no uh, um, uh, uh, path, no spiritual path, no understanding of the suffering that they're in, and no understanding about how to remove that suffering. So when we do that, Chandra Goman says, when we see that our relatives or our mothers or all beings are engulfed in this ocean of samsara and are like as if they've fallen into a pit of fire, then is it not shameful for us just to work on our own spiritual path, neglecting those who don't we cannot recognize due to the process of death and rebirth? Therefore, when we want to reflect on these things, he said it's like, um, why is it? Why would it be if it's abandoning the needs of others is really unsuitable for somebody who's got a bad reputation? If we find out in the news that such and such has abandoned their family and left them on the side of the road, for instance, um, uh, uh, if it's unsuitable for them, then why on earth it be appropriate for myself, right? So this is a way of thinking about saying it's important for me to take on the responsibility of beginning to repay their kindness and think what can I do? How can I benefit others? So again, using the same text, he repeats the same metaphor. The infant on the mother's lap can't do anything but suckles milk from the mother, which flows with the love. And through that same love, the mother endures many hardships. So who would abandon a mother like that, right? Therefore, there's this idea of saying, I want to take on a sense of responsibility to repay and to meet the needs of these beings, all these beings who have some understanding, some very, very great understanding. But on my side, I want to be able to help to provide some sort of kindness. And we do this in all sorts of ways, right? So again, we can think about that in terms of the way in which we work and what we do for work helps. It helps many beings, not just the ones that we know about. And we have this responsibility to do our best. And by doing our best this way, we can make a huge difference because we provide a model of behavior which other people see and those that we're looking after see as well. So we've got this responsibility, and in terms of the way in which we actually live our lives, this is how it's seen. We can see it. But it doesn't mean that this is enough, and we'll talk about that ever also. And then Jeremy Bichet says, um, how he is asked a question from well, how can we repay their help? What can we do? And he says it doesn't really matter how much wealth or happiness we are able to give these people because it deceives them. And what he's saying is here, you know, like from a position of samsara, when we receive contaminated pleasure, like through money and so on, we just develop attachment for it, clinging. And when we receive pain, we just have contaminated suffering. So being able to remove or exchange these sort of things in a contaminated sense is still deceptive. It doesn't really work for us. All we could do in the sense is sometimes give something that we think will help, and actually all we do is increase attachment or pride. Yeah. So in one way, we have to be careful because we could say, well, I'm doing very well. My mother's very proud of me because I'm a doctor. And she's like, yeah, my family, me, my. This has actually led to pride and all sorts of other issues, which is like, this is not the point. So we have to work on how, and it's not all bad, but we have to be careful about in terms of our spiritual practice, saying, well, what we need to do is to somehow mitigate that pride, not by becoming a bad doctor or whatever, but but essentially by trying to think about how best to address the specific needs of each individual. Yeah. So again, this is he sort of says, you know, he says he cites Baba Veka, which says, for instance, you know, my all these mother beings, they've suffered from all sorts of crazy afflictions and not been able to see clearly. They don't know what they don't know, right? And then I go going around, and all I've been doing is like rubbing salt on their wounds, making further trouble, bringing on more problems for them. So what I would need to do now is to establish um, establish these beings or help them on their path to liberation, to be free from suffering. So it said that, essentially, that having a kindness unrepaid weighs on us, weighs heavily on us. We want to repay our kindnesses, and he says it's the burden is like almost like the burden of the ocean with or a mountain. So we want to really think about working on repaying this kindness as well. And he says, Je Rinpoche says in brief, our mothers are crazed, unable to remain composed. They're blind, not literally, but in terms of the path. They have no guide. They stumble with every step. They can't even, they're walking like next to a precipice or a cliff, and they don't know whether or not what they're doing is going to make them fall or keep them alive. So he says, if her child doesn't take responsibility for freeing her from this terror, who should take responsibility? So this sense of it's her child who must set her free. Likewise, this madness of affections disturbs the peace of mind of all living beings, right? Our mothers. And they're crazed because they have no control over their minds. They have no training. We have no training. We're like that now, right? So what we're trying to do is to say, well, we need to do better too. We've got, if we want to do anything, our eyes are beginning to be a little bit open. What we're beginning to realize is we don't know very much, or we don't know how to do very much. But we're beginning to see that maybe we can do something more. So it's like the only way we can do that is to become a bit more able to do this. They have no teacher who's guide for the blind. They stumble because their wrongdoing cripples them at each moment, right? So it's this idea of to say, well, the best way for us to repay our mother's kindness is to help them to emerge from the cyclic existence. But the only way we can do that is by opening our eyes and being able to meet their needs and to be strong enough to do that reliably. Yeah. It's no good if we just have some intellectual idea and we don't know actually how to talk. One of the aspects of this is it's important to have great intelligence. In many ways, intelligence is very, very useful for being able to understand things, but it's wisdom that is able to meet the need of an individual. It's our experience and our understanding and our empathy that helps us make the right choices, not just intelligence. Very intelligent people can make very, very poor choices because they don't understand the context of a particular situation. A wise person can do that, right? So then this is um, is working on that and saying, okay, well, not only do I have these feelings from remembering their kindness, but also now I need to develop and cultivate love. So this is where we expand upon and develop even more strongly our intention to look after others, all beings. And Jeremshe says for us to recognize what love means in this case. So I've been using the word loving kindness because love is a big word in English, but in the specific case of what he's talking about here, the object of love is living beings who are in suffering, samsaric beings, yeah, those who are continuing to suffer. He says it doesn't mean that we shouldn't love Buddha, but love in this sense is about wishing them happiness, and Buddhas are happy. So we don't need to wish them happiness, right? When a Buddha is just sort of looks grumpy because somebody's done something that he needs training on, he might appear grumpy, right? And we have these wrathful deities who look very angry, and and um, but there's no anger inside. Yeah, there's no wrath really. There's no upset. I've said before many times when I was at Lam Rim Center, there was this thing where um, I was cleaning, painting a window in the shrine room, and we were painting it yellow. And while I was painting it, I was looking. Geshe Damshala was walking outside the window, and he saw me, and I saw him, and I sort of smiled, you know. And he looked back at me, and he sort of frowned, and I was like, oh. And but I thought, no, he's just messing around. So uh, I carried on, and then he sort of grimaced, like, that's not right, it's not respectful. And then I was a little bit like, maybe he's upset. And then it's like, so I was a little bit like a bit more careful, but I know, no, he's not, he's fine, he knows what I'm doing, he knows I'm doing everything well. And so I carried on, I smiled and laughed. And then his face went into a black rage. I mean, really, really dark rage, furious. And I thought, oh, I've made a mistake. You know, it's like I thought he was okay, and I've missed a trick, and he really is furious at me. So then I stopped, and I was like, I'm so, a little bit fearful. And and he pointed at me, and he was laughing so much. It's like, got you. So this sort of thing, right, we have is this relationship of with our teachers, or the Buddha is, we've got to be careful not to make a mistake. On their side, they're happy, right? They're always happy. They're working to help us. They're training us in all sorts of different ways. They're using what's necessary. And this is an important point, because when we're developing our loving kindness, we're developing our compassion and so on, it's not some sort of wet, lovey-dovey, oh, let's be nice, let's all hold hands, a sort of environment. We need to meet the specific needs of every individual. Sometimes that's being cross or looking cross, right? But inside is pure love and loving kindness and compassion. And we think we can use, as our model, our mothers and so on, who sometimes are a bit strict or a bit, tough on us. And it's like, well, um, this was done from love, not from some sort of fury or whatever. Their concern is they're worried that we might make a mistake. They're worried that we might develop some bad behaviors. So this really is what this whole thing about uh, 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 recognizing that when just because we're developing this infinite love, or love to all beings, endless love, boundless love, and boundless compassion, is that we need to be strong, not weak. We've got to be strong in our compassion, and we've got to meet the specific needs of individuals, not just become a sort of a mat to be walked over, right? So internally, our mind is one of loving kindness. Sometimes we need to be a little bit tough, and that's absolutely correct. That's not sort of prevaricating or trying to change it. It's not about just being soft all the time. In our minds, we're feeling soft, but in our behavior, we have to do what's right. Anybody who's had an extended amount of time with their teacher will know that the more the teacher trusts them as a student, the more the greater the tendency they have for becoming very, very tough on you, more and more strict, and more like nothing, no smiles, no laugh, just, what are you doing? What are you doing there? So this sort of, in a sense, is like a way of a mark of recognizing that you're sincere in your practice. Yeah. Not all teachers are like that, but some are. Some are. So Jeremshe says, look, when we're looking at this, when in terms of thinking about our mothers as suffering and filled with um, delusions and afflictions and so on, and blind, he said, we're doing this for the sake of the meditation. We don't go around saying, oh, yeah, well, you're just an untrained, blind fool that doesn't know anything, suffering from afflictions, right? He says this is not appropriate at all. He says, it's really improper to look for other people's faults, and it's actually really wonderful to notice virtues. So, but this is in this particular type of meditation, this particular scope of meditation, and it's okay to feel that way. But also, we need to remember ourselves are just in the same boat, right? So it's not as if we are any better than them, or whatever. We're doing our best. We've chosen a path. We've chosen to do this, but until we've actually got something to show for it, right? Like in enlightenment, then really we've got nothing we can demonstrate. So so this love, right, primarily is said to be, the quality of love is such that it's one of the most powerful healers of all, and is greater than any sort of material offering. And great love, we're talking about, and a boundless love, right? So this love that reaches all beings without exception, all sentient beings without exception. Je Rinpoche talks quite a lot about the benefit of love, and he says, the benefit in the future is many, many benefits of high rebirth and all sorts of things. There's protections, there's all sorts of protections against you, and so on. And I think one of the things is it sounds, especially when we read it from a 14th century text where he's quoting sutra, it sounds all quite unbelievable. But one of the things that I think is absolutely relevant to here is that when we've managed to achieve even a small amount of love and a small amount of kindness in our minds, right, towards or everybody, this acts as an empowerment. It empowers us. It gives us a sort of superpower, and it's not just doesn't make us fly, right? But there's sort of in terms, I think it originated from feminism. There's this idea of the invisible knapsack or the invisible passport, and it's this thing that when we have privilege, when we come from a privileged background, no matter what sort of privilege it might be, the color of our skin or our addiction or our education, or it might be our religion or which country we come from, or it could be who we are in the family, or all these different things, um, or our gender or our sexuality, all of these different things. We don't necessarily recognize what privilege they give us, because when we walk into a shop, we might be treated very, very well, and we might be given lots of service. And we think, oh, this is a nice shop, they're very nice, and so on. We don't recognize that's because of these invisible signs that we're giving. We don't see that until we go to somewhere different, where we don't have those privileges. Maybe another country where we're looked down upon for being who we are or whatever. And then it's like, oh, this, it's a bit nasty here. And it's like, well, you go back to where you were and you'll find that actually you were in a minority there as well, right? So this quality of this privilege that we carry, which we're not aware of, is very, very normal. It's not unusual at all. And it's only when somebody is able to sort of pick up on saying, oh, and then the way in which they're treated changes. But and this is the point I'm trying to raise, is if we have this loving kindness, if we have this genuine loving kindness where we naturally treat people with this openness, this open mind, it's like a gold visa. It's like it's like an invisible gold visa. It's amazing. It doesn't seem to matter whether or not we're the wrong gender or the wrong sexuality or the wrong race or anything. There's a change. And that is something one can actually see. This is a sort of one of the superpowers of loving kindness, of love, is that it opens doors that would otherwise be closed, because people at a deep unconscious level recognize and feel that level of kinship. And that's something we can actually discover for ourselves. It's not just Ben saying it. We can actually find out for ourselves if that's true. So doing this meditation, even in this lifetime, makes us huge difference to the way in which we live our lives. It won't bring us fame. It won't bring us wealth necessarily. These sort of things are not really relevant. But it does bring us connection. And it does help us in our path. And those are very, very valuable indeed. So in the text it says, if you have love, then deities and humans will love you and will naturally gravitate towards you, um, and um, and love is a supreme protector and so on. So these sorts of things are like, well, okay, but we can actually see this ourselves if we think about it in a modern terminology. So again, how do we cultivate this love? So this is the same structural of meditation that's used for remembering kindness, for remembering for impartiality, for loving kindness, and for compassion. So first of all, we start off with feeling a cultivation of a love towards our friends. The actual friends, not just friend things that we may imagine, people who we know. And then for people for whom we have neutral feelings, again, people who we know. So actually bring to recollection these people, and then towards people who we're not so comfortable with, and then gradually towards all beings. Now, one of the ways in which this is often taught in the West is say, well, first of all, cultivate love for yourself. And in fact, it's not always the case that you are a friend. Some people don't really consider themselves to be a friend. They may sort of feel rather indifferent towards themselves, or they might actually feel rather um, like they don't want to spend much time with themselves. And but it's just as relevant. Is essentially that whichever group we put ourselves in, yes, we should do that. So when we hear these teachings, sometimes they say, first, use yourself, develop love for yourself. But you can't love others without loving yourself. And we find this in the Tibet tradition from this this specific meditation. And the point is that during that meditation session, we should not stop at self. We need to continue the meditation to include all sentient beings. So when we talk about saying first love yourself, that doesn't mean that that's where you stop, right? You need to then think, okay, then your friends, then then people who you're indifferent to, and then your enemies, and then extend that to all sentient beings, and that is the full session of the meditation. So this is really important in terms of recognizing that there's nothing wrong specifically with developing a love for oneself as a part of a larger meditation. If we have, and again, this is, remember, as I said, you start off with those you love, and it might be that you don't love yourself very much, in which case to start off with yourself would be a mistake. You need to work on that when you're dealing with your enemies, right? So, I'm an enemy, then I'm in that group. So that's why, in a sense, Je Rinpoche doesn't say you, because it's not necessarily true that you love yourself, right? So then that sense is what. So we develop our love, he says, Je Rinpoche says, we cultivate this by thinking repeatedly how all living beings are in samsara are lacking in suffering, both in happiness. Sorry, they're lacking in happiness. They're lacking in joy, both contaminated, in other words, normal samsaric joy, and also uncontaminated, in other words, the joy of enlightenment, right? So this word contaminated means it's still within samsara. The joy of a laugh during a party, right, would be contaminated because it's not liberating us to enlightenment. Uncontaminated joy is the joy of enlightenment. So this just word here is important to get it correct, what uncontaminated or contaminated means. So when we become familiar with the fact that all beings are lacking in a continual happiness, then we want to wish them happiness. We want to say, well, it would be lovely if you could be happy. What can I do? How can I do that? So by then thinking about, again, starting with material individuals, thinking about various forms of happiness and how we could offer that to them. And this is a way of us then extending that to all sentient beings, a sense of seeing how can I bring happiness? And this is the meaning of love, right? The meaning of love is how can I bring happiness to somebody? And then the compassion is how can I remove suffering? So these things are sort of related in a sense. We learned in the middle scope teaching that especially contaminated happiness is just a reduction of suffering. But the way in which we intend it is slightly different. The focus of our intention is to bring joy and to remove suffering. So it's a giving of joy, giving of happiness, and a taking or removing of suffering. So this is very similar in terms of the object, but actually in terms of our relationship to it, it's a bit different. And again, so the object of compassion is all beings who experience misery, all beings who are within samsara. And he says through any of the three types of suffering. So this is again the suffering of pain or suffering of suffering, the suffering of change, the fact that everything is chaotic and unreliable, and then also the suffering, pervasive suffering, the fact that while we are born in samsara with a contaminated mind filled with afflictions, we will continue to create more suffering for ourselves. So then again, the subjective aspect of this is we start off thinking how nice it would be if all beings were free from suffering. May they be free from suffering, may they be free from suffering, and then actually I'll do something about it. So we start off thinking, oh, recognizing all sentient beings have this suffering, and then thinking, wouldn't it be nice? It would be great if they could be free from that, right? World peace, and then if you like, these things, and then it's like, okay, well, um, um, this is something that they should be. It is a worthy cause to work towards that freedom. And then it's like saying, okay, well, it being a worthy cause, I will put effort towards that, right? I will do something about that. And again, he says the steps of cultivating compassion again are similarly, we start with our friends, then we move to those beings for whom we have neutral feelings, and then we extend it to the enemies. And then when we have great compassion, equal compassion rather, for our enemies and our friends, we then gradually include all beings in the 10 directions. And then Je Rinpoche says, look, I want to explain a little bit. So these discourses we've been talking about of developing, gradually cultivating impartiality through the friends, neutral, enemies, everyone route. And then he did the same for love, compassion, and so on, while distinguishing the specific variations in terms of this, is an extremely important point. And Je Rinpoche says, the reason why is because if we do this without actually taking specific objects, people we relate to initially, then and we only use a general object from the outset, so we're all sentient beings from the outset, then we just seem to generate these. But when we actually encounter them in our daily lives, we'll fall short. So it's when we actually apply them to specific individuals, especially those who we see a lot of the time, we will notice a transformative change. And this is what we're looking for. Remember, the point about this is the way in which it changes our daily behavior, not some sort of theory, but the way in which we're actually choosing to live our lives and the way in which we experience our lives. This is what matters most. From moment to moment, the opportunity to do better. And so we see this thing primarily of saying we can work on specifically those that we're close to, or those we're surrounded by, those who we know, and then we can rely upon this transformative experience to accept that whoever comes along into our lives, we will be able to apply that same approach. And he said it's best often to really gradually increase the number of individuals that we can actually visualize within our meditation. But what we're reaching to is the point where at the end of the session, we should be looking at all beings. Yeah. And he says the way to cultivate this is primarily through considering all the general and specific sufferings are mentioned in the Four Noble Truths that we taught before, such as the 6 types of suffering, the 8 types of suffering, the 8 sufferings, the 6 sufferings, the 3 types of suffering. This way helps us to recognize that it's not just me who's doing this in samsara, it's everybody in samsara is having the same issue. And he says, well, by remembering this, recollecting the power of the Four Noble Truths, the suffering, the truth of suffering in our meditation regarding all sentient beings, then compassion is easily generated. It's not even complicated. So, but it depends upon us having an accurate understanding of the Four Noble Truths. So this is why Buddhism is sort of a wisdom-based in terms of saying it's not just words, it's not just Sanskrit words that we're learning, but it's actually using these different meditations to trigger further meditations, right? And this particular case is where we're looking at the Four Noble Truths themselves, the truth of suffering and the cause of suffering, to help us recognize that all beings have this, and therefore for us to be determined to do something about it. And he says this is important. If you do not consider your own suffering and we do not recognize samsara, then it really doesn't work for us. So we've got to sort of actually understand, we have to have a clear view of how we are suffering in samsara. And this is why essentially Je Rinpoche taught the middle scope, why he taught the Four Noble Truths in the previous text, is because we need to have this understanding. We've got to have this feeling. We've got to feel this, that we're bound in samsara, for us to be able to actually develop compassion. If we do not know suffering, how can we feel compassionate is the question, right? If we do not know suffering, how can we be empathic? And this is why suffering is so powerful for us. And then Je Rinpoche says, look, this is illustrative. The way in which I've provided some sort of stimulus for us to work on, but in the end, we need to use our own creative intelligence. So these are aspects, like I was saying earlier on, about working on developing a sense of relationship with others, and a sense of recognizing their kindness. We need to use those arguments which we find bring us to that understanding. The facts, or the dispute of the facts, isn't important. What's important is the mental state that we're able to arrive at. Yeah. And he says, if we can use many, many different viewpoints and find different ways through, then these overlap and we can develop much love and compassion. So don't feel that you need to be strict and follow only a traditional methodology. You can use whatever methodology you like. And he says that it's important. He says, just because I've said it, don't just depend upon my words. You need to think yourself. You have to find your own ways. You've got to know your own mind and use that and reflect upon that to work how best to establish this compassion and love. And he says, otherwise, depending just upon me, and it'd be quite weak. And he says again, we need to be careful that we need to actually really recognize what these states of mind are, based on the previous explanations, how important is compassion. Compassion is the root, but also how important impartiality is, what that means, how to develop it, and and how this development of this spirit, this mind to be a Buddha, opens the gate to Mahayana. When we grasp it, then we are able to actually allow it to grow. So we're looking at experiential environment. We're looking at the experience that actually sets us on the path, not just learning about things. And he said this is also true for all the other practices that I'm teaching in the Lam Rim. But he's saying this is, it's a point that it can't be overstated, is what he's also saying here. And then Kamala, he cites Kamala Shila and says, look, when you feel the same compassion, like this, just as similar to a mother's wish to remove her dear child's unhappiness. So like a young mother who sees a sort of a wince on the face of her baby, her newborn baby, she's reaches out immediately and wants to comfort or tickle or do something to help ease that little discomfort. He says, when we feel that spontaneously towards all beings, right, then our compassion is complete. And then we can call it great compassion. And he says, this is also that we need to think about this as the same sort of measure we can use for great love. And he said that once we've got that, once we've actually developed that level of compassion and love, then, bodhicitta, this is spirit of enlightenment, is easy. It's no problem at all for us. And therefore, Jeremy says, this is a necessary cause for developing bodhicitta. We need to have this great compassion. We need to have that spontaneous sense of loving kindness. So, and he says we can also use this as a measure of our bodhicitta, our spirit of enlightenment. If we are able to have this spontaneous sense of love and compassion for all beings, we will affect directly correspond to the level of our spirit of enlightenment. And again, he says this is, it doesn't, not just for higher beings, not just for the enlightened beings, but even for us beginners. It doesn't matter where we are. We've got to recognize this. Je Rinpoche then cites Asanga again, and he says, this quality, this aspiration. He says, even at the beginning of the 3 eons it'll take us to become a Buddha, um, at this point we must also develop such a spirit of enlightenment. So it feels like, well, that sounds really um, hard, yeah. But also remember, we have already been practicing many previous lives. We don't necessarily know where we are on our path to enlightenment, but at the same time, to recognize and to revisit developing this loving kindness, developing this compassion, great compassion, is an entry point for us in this life. Right, it's where we can get back into the harness, if you like, of our actual meditation and our actual Mahayana practice. So it might not be the first life; it might be many lives that we've already practiced as a Mahayana practitioner. But we've got to get back into that harness, and that harness is to recognize the suffering and feel the suffering, spontaneous love and compassion for all sentient beings. And he says, so suppose that we're nowhere near these objectives and we give rise merely to the thought, well, I'm going to be a Buddha for the sake of all beings, and in order to do this, I will cultivate the virtues of a bodhisattva. And he says, if we think at that point we've attained bodhicitta, we're making a mistake. We really need to have some experiential result to this. And he says, if we also, he might be that we might hold, we recognize that bodhicitta, the spirit of enlightenment, is the core personal instruction, and yet we, instead of training it, we do lots of other things, then we're just making a claim without any substance, likewise. And he reminds us, he says, look, many books say that when we are on the path, on the Mahayana path, we spend eons learning how to develop this spontaneous compassion and this spontaneous love. So don't be surprised if it's hard. But even recognizing that it's valuable, even recognizing that we can start to do it, even recognizing that it's a worthy goal, is a huge benefit, huge benefit. And doing our very best, even the very small amount that we can do, especially in the modern world where everybody is interested in things like wealth, if we can develop this loving kindness, then it has a huge benefit. There's no doubt about it. So it's not so much important for us to think, okay, well, I haven't really got spontaneous compassion like the mother towards a baby, towards all sentient beings. I mean, honestly, it's beyond me. But for us not to feel disconcerted by this and to think, yes, but I can work on that. I'm able to do that. It's something I can do. I can reach that. And when I reach that, then I'm able to enter into the Mahayana path. I can say yes, and now my bodhicitta is present. And of course, once we're doing that, we must continue to evaluate it. And so he says, Jeremy says quite rightly that merely uttering the words that in order to progress on the path, we have to do this or do that. We need to, we take the bodhisattva vow and whatever, and therefore we're engaged bodhisattvas. He said this not really doesn't work this way. Okay, so it's a little bit longer than I meant, but we've only got a page, so at the end of then we develop this resolve, which is to recognize, saying, I'm going to step up, I'm going to do this, I'm going to take part in this, I'm going to solve this, I'm going to meet the needs of others, and do this based on this spontaneous compassion, recognizing, having faith in Buddhahood, being able to do this, right? And we've got to then work on it every single moment in our lives, not just when we're in meditation session. Every opportunity we have to develop our loving kindness and to develop our compassion and to recognize this and to dwell on it and to expand on it and engage in it. This is a lifetime pursuit, not just one on an occasion or sitting on a cushion. In fact, it's often easier to do it when we're engaging with people. And he said, you know, it will be hard. This is a hard thing to do. Our minds are filled with rubbish from previous life, previous problems, and current life, current problems. We've got all this luggage we're carrying around. So trying to work on developing loving kindness and loving and compassion is really hard and really, really difficult. But then at last we recognize, saying, having stepped up to meet the needs of all, we recognize, and this depends upon our understanding of Buddhahood, that Buddhahood is the only path to be able to offer this. And therefore, he says, it's really also important for us to know, to recognize what Buddha is. And he says, you know, we should recognize the qualities of a Buddha. We consider what the refuge is that Buddha offers, know what it means to be a Buddha. And then we're able to see, yes, okay, it's true. A Buddha is actually able to do this. And I can become a Buddha. I can do that. It'll take time. It'll take training, but it's available to me. I should feel empowered to be able to do that. And Jeremy also says, you know, actually, although there are many texts given on developing bodhicitta, actually it's best for us to do it ourselves. We need to do it in our own minds. We need to work on it ourselves. We need to step up. And to do this based, overcome by compassion as a part of our role is by far in a way the most powerful. And one of the reasons for this is because there is no end to the compassion. Once we're able to develop it, it doesn't matter however far along the path we are, we will still feel and recognize the suffering of all beings. It doesn't change. It's always going to be present. And therefore, it is a goad, it is a stick, or a carrot, if you like, that will, or the stick, really, that sense of urgency and of needing to meet the needs of all beings that will keep us on our path. Fruit, the carrot is Buddhahood, right? Is the benefits of being a Buddha, or benefits of being enlightened, being liberated from suffering. And then Jeremy finishes the chapter by just saying that essentially what we must do is to recognize that first of all we have this aspiration arising from our concern and our decision, and then we engage in the bodhisattva vows. We take the bodhisattva vows, and once we've taken the bodhisattva vows with that spirit, with that mind of intention, then it becomes engaged bodhisattva, bodhicitta, an engaged mind of enlightenment. So that's when we actually begin to start training in the bodhisattva path. So he says there are lots of arguments about this, but primarily the engaged spirit is present once we've taken the vows, and before that it's an aspirational spirit. And he says there are many different arguments, but I'm not really interested in arguing about this here. So he just leaves it be because he's interested in us practicing it, not in us filling our minds with academic dispute. Okay, so on that note, I want to dedicate any merit that came out from this slightly extended talk towards being able to work towards achieving a universal loving kindness and compassion from which all great things come, and one of them being Buddhahood. So and recognizing that suffering of all beings is absolutely relevant, and recognizing that depends upon my understanding of the Four Noble Truths. So this is what I want to dedicate, is to become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings through understanding and through developing the path right from the beginning, and keeping understanding and working slowly on being able to call myself a Buddhist, and then taking that on. Okay, so let's then thank you, and then let's just meditate for a minute or two on any of the topics we've discussed today.